Thank you very much. Good morning. It's very nice to be with you today. My job is to run a global humanitarian charity. We work in war zones, in refugee hosting states, on refugee transit routes, and we also do refugee resettlement in the United States. I was in Iraq last week, in Mosul, in Fallujah, in Erbil in the north, looking at the consequences of the most recent conflict there. And we work across Africa. The Middle East is important for us, and we're deploying a big team into Bangladesh to help the 650,000 Rohingya who've just fled from Myanmar. I thought I would talk to you today about what NGOs and corporates need to do when governments are in retreat, which is what I see around the world. And the question I want to ask is, what should corporates and NGOs do when governments are in retreat? The answer, I think, is that we have to step up, and we have to step up together, not just because of the resources that we have together to make a difference around the world, but also because if we don't step up, then the connected, empowered, democratized world that is the ethos of this conference is frankly under threat. And I just want to try and cover that in the next 15 minutes or so and leave a few minutes for questions at the end. The starting point is that this is the second time I've spoken at this conference. I spoke here in 2007, in April 2007, and I talked about how we were in a new era. I said that the 1940s were defined by the phrase, "we need," and gave birth to the welfare state. The 1980s were defined by the idea of "we want," and we're in tune with a consumerist age. And in the 2000s, I said, were defined by the idea "we can." I think there's no shame in admitting that a young man called Barack Obama did rather better with the idea of "yes, we can" than I did. But he spoke to a sense of optimism, a sense of confidence about the possibilities of a connected world. And the reason for mentioning that is not nostalgia, it's contrast, because today the zeitgeist is not about the benefits, the opportunities, the resources of a connected world. The zeitgeist is about political dysfunction. It's about what Richard Haas, the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations in the US, calls the abdication of Western responsibility, US responsibility for leadership. It's about divide between generations, not the idea that a new generation is leading. And it seems to me that in that contrast, in that change in the zeitgeist, there are two very stark alternatives for how you respond. One is to say that the inequalities, the insecurities, the instabilities of globalization need to be tackled, the unfairnesses need to be tackled. And the alternative is to say that we should roll back globalization itself, deglobalization. We should retreat. And it is a source of enormous sadness to me that actually retreat is the defining feature of political leadership, especially in the West at the moment. There is a retreat from a really fundamental idea of what it means to live in an interdependent world. An interdependent world says that there is no such thing as far away. There was defined really the post-Second World War era. John Kennedy gave a speech in 1962 in Philadelphia where he talked about America's commitment to a declaration of interdependence. And it was a commitment to mutual responsibility. The indivisible liberty of all as important as the liberty of one, he said. That is not the ethos today. In the West, governments are localizing rather than thinking globally. There's a retreat from international institutions. The central problem around the world today, when you look at the refugee crisis, the climate crisis, I would argue issues of corporate taxation as well, global regulation, the central issue is not that international institutions are too strong, it's that they're too weak. But there has been a retreat from international institutions, and nowhere more so than in this country. It grieves me that when in 2008 we put through Parliament the Lisbon Treaty, which made provision for the first time for a country to leave the European Union, I asked the civil servants at the time, I said, look, no one is going to trigger this Article 50 until they know exactly how they're going to leave. Because it's a 2-year deadline, and you give away your cards once you trigger Article 50. And they said, no, look, obviously it would only be like the Czechoslovakia situation where the divorce is agreed and it's all organized. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that it would be the UK that was the country that was plunging itself into a divorce without knowing how it was going to live afterwards. And there's also a retreat from fundamental norms of human rights and commitments to individual freedom that defined the post-war era. And I see these 3 retreats every day in the work that we do. I see a retreat from the idea that there's no such thing as far away in government's feeling that charity shouldn't just begin at home, it should end at home. I see the retreat in the weakness of the international response to the global refugee crisis. And I see the undercutting of fundamental commitments to basic human rights and the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers around the world. And it seems to me that the question, therefore, is what should we do about it? And my argument would be that it's going to take the corporate sector and the NGOs to step up and provide the leadership that government is failing to offer. And I would argue that as a moral case, but also as a strategic case. Because the truth is, we're in a situation today where 1 in every 110 people in the planet has been displaced by war and persecution around the world. There are 25 million refugees, there are 40 million internally displaced. That's affecting countries like Nigeria, it's affecting countries like Lebanon and Jordan, it's affecting countries like Bangladesh and Myanmar. It's affecting Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the truth is that those problems inside those countries don't remain inside those countries. They wash up on the shores of Europe and more globally. And one of the things I've learned, I've been doing my job for about 4 years now. I mean, there are some really striking things about this refugee crisis that call for the spirit of insurgency and innovation that defines the people in this room. The traditional image of a refugee was someone who was out of their own country for a few years while a war was going on and they went home. That's now fundamentally wrong. The traditional image is that they would live in a refugee camp. Today, 80% of refugees are out of their own country for at least 10 years, and 60% for more than 20 years. 60% of refugees live in urban areas, not in refugee camps. So it's an urban experience. You go to Beirut, you go to Istanbul, that's where you'll find today's refugees. More than half of the world's refugees are women and kids. Much smaller proportion of the single men who are demonized in various of the politics around this. And that issue of the duration of displacement and the location of displacement in urban areas means that we need to have a completely different way of thinking about the way in which refugees and displaced people need to be helped. And I think that the way I would sum it up is that instead of putting the premium only on helping people survive until they go home, less than 2% of the world's refugees went home last year, we've got to start thinking about how we help people thrive, not just about how we help them survive. And for that, we're going to need corporations as well as NGOs to work in very, very different ways. Just to give you one example, they actually deserve this credit, even though they're the hosts of this conference. Google have actually helped us. They could help us more, Matt. But Google have done something really smart with us. What's the first thing that a refugee does when they land off a boat in Greece? They get out their mobile phone to find out where are they. And what came up in 2015 was literally a load of Greek. And so with Google, we have developed a website called refugee.info, which provides the basic information of where you are, where can you access services. 800,000 refugees have used that service over the last 3 years. And there are, I think, a team of 12 or 15 Google engineers have just come back from Jordan because they're going to do the same thing with us for refugees in the Middle East. And my plea would be that in 3 areas, we really need your help. We really need your help in delivering education to child refugees and displaced children. Just have this in your head. Half of the world's displaced people, refugees and internally displaced, are children, yet 2% of the global humanitarian budget goes on education. And so my plea is not just for you to make financial investment. These are kids who have suffered unspeakable trauma of living under ISIS or living through war. They need social and emotional investment to enable them to access anything like a curriculum. We have to really change the way, not just the amount that we invest, but the way in which we invest in the education of the next generation. And if you want an example of where head and heart come together, just think about the consequences of neglecting the education of the half of the 25 million refugees, the half of the 40 million internally displaced who are children who are getting very little education at all. Just to give you a sense of it, half of primary school age refugee children are not in school, 3/4 of secondary school aged refugee children are not in school. So in somewhere like Lebanon, 250,000 Syrian kids have never had any education for the last 6 years. And ask yourself, is that a recipe for a stable and secure future? It obviously isn't. The second area where we need your help is in the delivery of cash to displaced people. The biggest thing that displaced people lack is cash. There's someone in this room who said that his parents fled Hungary in 1956 with their toothbrush. That's all they had. And that is the refugee experience today as well. And the biggest thing that we can do for refugee or displaced children is to give them cash, either electronically or literally in cash. It empowers them. It brings finance into the local economy. It's so much more beneficial than giving them food or tents or fleeces. And we need to be able to do that securely and much more cheaply than we're able to do it at the moment. We need your help in doing that, identifying the right people and getting them the cash. Third thing we need your help in is with employment. If you think that 80% of refugees are displaced for more than 10 years, they need to be making a contribution to the countries that they are landing in. And that is as true in Lebanon and Jordan as it is in Germany or in the United States. We're really proud that companies like Intel and Starbucks have made big commitments to offer employment to refugees. But you doing your, I met in San Francisco last 2 weeks ago, a young man who was a videographer from Aleppo, and he is one of the very few Syrians who've been allowed into the United States recently. More Syrians were killed in the Douma chemical weapons attack than have been allowed into the US as refugees over the last 6 months. He's one of them. He's now a videographer working for Apple in, sorry to mention them, but in Silicon Valley. We need you to do the day job of employing these people and giving them a chance, whether it be in the West or in the countries that they land. Most refugees are in poor countries, not in rich countries. 88% of the world's refugees are in poor and lower middle income countries, not in the West. 1% of the world's refugees are in the US, 6% in Europe. So this is a poor and developing country challenge. Now this stepping up is going to have to take place in the context of a dehumanization, of a demonization that is core to political rhetoric. And my point to you is that we will not be able to have the blessings of a connected world if we are not willing to step up to take the responsibilities of a connected world. And we cannot rely on governments to do that for us. We have to do that ourselves. One of the things that I've reflected on over the last year or so is that my organization, it's called the International Rescue Committee. It was founded by Albert Einstein to rescue Jews from Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. And obviously that work of rescue is above all for the benefit of the people who we are helping. We think we helped 26 million people around the world last year, delivering healthcare, water and sanitation, employment protection for women and kids. But there's also something deeper going on which speaks to the theme that I raised at the beginning of this talk, which is that the work of rescue is not just about them, the refugees, it's also about us and what we in the West stand for. If we're going to stand for a empowering, democratizing, connected world, then we're going to have to make sure that we tackle the inequalities and the vulnerabilities that are associated with it. And that was a task that in the 1940s was embraced by the West. It was Western leadership that created international institutions and gave rights to refugees for the first time. The shining light of the 1951 Refugee Convention spoke to a period in which peace and prosperity would become much more widely spread than ever before. And the challenge today is that that period of peace and prosperity becomes a blip rather than the trend. And the danger is that while in the 40s the rights for refugees were a shining light of what was to come, the danger now is that the treatment of refugees around the world and displaced people are actually storm clouds for a wider crisis of the connected world. So I think we have a strong moral interest, but also a strong economic and strategic interest in recognizing the scale of the challenge, understanding the shift in the zeitgeist, diagnosing its causes, and then stepping up to show that these problems are manageable, not insoluble. Because if one thing defines this conference above all, it's that problems are there to be solved, not to be ignored. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Sir, you had your hand up.
Thank you very much. My name is Fadi Ghandour. I'm Jordanian. So talking about how the West can step up. So Jordan has, as you know, about 1.2 million Syrian refugees, 400,000 Iraqis from the 90s. Host communities are challenged. So you talk about jobs. Host communities are challenged and are resisting and politically resisting to allow people to actually work. And specifically in Jordan or in Lebanon, poor countries, the West has not really stepped up, trickling down a little bit of aid here and there. Jordan is probably the second poorest country in water per capita. If you're worried, if the West is worried about refugees coming to the West, and most of the refugees are sitting in poorer countries, then wouldn't you think that there should be a much better and a much different way of how you are going to address the challenges of these people who are living in dire conditions and helping the host communities actually make life easier so that we can allow these refugees to work and thrive with us?
I get it, I get it. It's a great,
Thank you.
It's a great question. I promise you I'll answer it. Should we take two or three and then I'll answer them together? There's a lady right here at the front.
Yeah, I'm Catherine Wines. I'm a co-founder of a company called WhereRemit, an online money transfer remittance company. Just wanted to express a couple of our challenges to help the refugees. You know, first in a country like, for example, in Europe, is identification. The government gives sometimes some kind of ID card, but that's not recognized, and therefore people cannot open bank accounts, and therefore they can't use our services. On the other end, trying to send to countries like Syria and Sudan and so on, we find that our banks would close our account if we were to send to those countries. So I think there's a lot of work, and I know there are a lot of banks in here today that they really need to rethink about, you know, the way they see those countries.
Great. Yeah, the lady there.
My name is Ellen. I'm from Israel. I want to ask you about something a little different. About Falun Gong situation in China, if you know about it and how you can help. Just to do background for you, it's some...
the background will have to wait because this,
okay.
If you start giving a background on Falun Gong, we're going to be here for a very long time. Just one more. Yeah, and then we'll finish off.
Jamie Drummond from One. A group of us are meeting with President Macron about his Sahel alliance. There have been many Sahel initiatives over the years. Any advice for him and his team as they approach the G7 and how they could make this Sahel alliance work?
Great. Just to run through, you raise a really important point. The unemployment rate among young Jordanians is about, I think, 32%. The overall unemployment rate is 18%. And my argument is that you can only help the refugees if you help the host community. And that is a macroeconomic problem or challenge as well as a microeconomic challenge. Just so you understand, Jordan has a dollar peg. It has an IMF program. Its debt to GDP ratio has gone from 50% to 90% in the space of the last 6 years. It's a population of about 7.5 million, and there are 650,000 refugees, and the Jordanian government says about 500,000 unregistered refugees. So you can see the scale of it. You will only be able to extend working rights to refugees if there is a new deal for the Jordanian population as a whole. Just get this, The requirements of the IMF program are that the Jordanian debt to GDP goes down to 77% of GDP over the next 6 years. That's led to a range of austerity measures across the country, including for refugees, that the charge for going to a health center has gone from $1 per visit to $6, $6 Jordanian dollars per visit. So they're suffering together and they need to help together. And it's certainly a big part of our push that our services are open to Jordanians as well as to refugees, but there needs to be a macroeconomic answer to it as well. On your question about the Sahel, about the money transfer, I think you should talk to me separately, because you're right that a lot of the places we work, there is either a problem in using banks or there aren't any banks. And we've got quite a lot of experience of how to get cash into situations where there aren't traditional financial institutions. Whether or not your company is able to help, I don't know, but I'd be very happy to talk to you. I'm not going to be able to get into the Falun Gong issue. I'm sorry. I apologize to you. The work that I know about from my current job is about displacement from conflict above all. There is an issue about refugees who flee from persecution, which of course has been an important origin of the current Refugee Act. From a previous life, I did quite a lot of work with the government and others, but I won't be able to get into it here, so I apologize. It doesn't really speak to the issue that I've got. On Sahel, and I've got sort of 20 seconds to go for the tragedy of the Sahel, it gets left to the last 20 seconds. I think the biggest thing that you could say to President Macron is that he has to look really hard about why countries like Niger have had a 30 to 40-year struggle to maintain political stability, deliver economic growth, contain population growth, and learn, number one, learn the lessons. Number two, I'm very struck by the extent to which long-standing social and economic inequalities are being exploited for political radicalization. And you've got a session later on this morning about radicalization. I think that there isn't a military answer to that. And I think that that's going to be an important part of the conversation, because I know that the French government are very concerned about that. The third is that I think that, a bit like the question to our Jordanian colleague, we need to reboot the way the international financial system works, because the truth is that the humanitarian aid sector is trying to tackle long-term problems with short-term money. I mean, I'm running a $762 million organization. We do $500 million worth of work around the world. I'm running 450 government grants, and the average size of a grant is about $1 million a year, and the average length is 11 months. And the problems we're dealing with are long-term problems. So I would beg him to attack the fiction that this is going to be solved in his first presidential term. Beg him to be honest that this is going to take more than one presidential term to get to grips with it. And it's going to take a different kind of engagement from the international sector. Thank you very much indeed.